Welcome to today's webinar on behavior change in organizations. We decided to put on this webinar because we had such an overwhelming response of people wanting to hear more about the psychology behind behavior change in organizations. And our in-person event that we had a couple of weeks ago was completely sold out. So you will today get a chance to hear the highlights of our research in this space. But it is worth mentioning that we usually run our work psychology network events in person. So although there will be an opportunity today to ask questions and interact and pose questions to the research author Rob Briner, at our in-person events, there is, of course, lots more opportunity to have discussion and to really get into the practical application of some of these principles within your organizations. So this is a great snippet, but we hope that some of you will be able to join us at our events next year. We this year held events on motivation and work performance, on assessing potential, and on behavior change. And next year, we're going to be looking at predicting performance. We're going to be looking at understanding teams and team effectiveness. And we will also be looking at feedback and work performance. So lots to come. And, it really does. It's been a great launch of our work psychology network. And, thanks for everyone who has shown so much interest in what we're up to here. And we really saw that, some of the HR activity that was going on in organizations really lacked that scientific evidence and the underpinning of the principles of psychology that could really enhance its effectiveness. And so we've brought this network together to hopefully make some change in that space and to really provide you with some of those principles to help you do better HR activity and business activity. So I'm Mel, I'm CRF's Commercial Director, and I am here today with Rob Briner. Rob is the Professor of Organizational Psychology at the School of Business and Management at Queen Mary University in London. And we're also lucky that Rob is our Associate Research Director, and he is also the lead of our work psychology network and the author of the research that you'll hear today and upcoming. So Rob, I will hand over to you to share the latest highlights.
Thank you. Thanks, Mel. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So we have a few answers to the poll. Thank you very much who did it. And the question you were asked is, what do you mean by behavior change in your function, and what do your businesses mean by behavior? Anonymous says how we conduct ourselves, the conduct of workers, compliance, observable ways, the way individual acts or reacts, how people do things, cultural norms, that's quite an interesting one, how people react, the actions taken, responses, the actions of individuals, the way employees act and behave at work, talking about coordinated responses and how we interact with other people, conduct, action, change in mindset. That's great. That's really interesting. And I think it will play quite well, actually, into the discussion we'll go into fairly sort of soon about the, about the nature of change and nature of behavioral change in organizations. So let's start at the beginning here. And I think for me, HR is very much about, as Mel kind of indicated, it's really about behavior in organizations. Clearly, HR does lots of different things. Some of them are they're just required to do, they're legal things, they're just transactional stuff. But ultimately, what HR is trying to do through everything it does, apart from those things, is to shape human behavior. In other words, HR is there to help the business and help the business achieve its objectives, largely through shaping and changing employee behavior. Some HR practices are very, very broad, and they don't focus very directly on what it is exactly employees are doing, or particularly on specific behaviors. They're quite broad, such as the idea of reward. We just provide rewards and kind of hope they shape behavior in the way we want. But other HR practices are deliberately and actually trying to change very specific behaviours that are very specifically linked to organisational objectives. And it's these behaviour change interventions that are the focus of this report, not those other more diffuse kind of approaches, I suppose. I think an underpinning approach to this is this behavioural perspective of HRM. There's sort of 6 points to it. Firstly, the focus in HRM should be on the desired employee behaviours. In other words, which specific behaviours are desirable given the objectives of the organisation. Second, different organisations need different employee behaviours because organisations have different objectives, structures, and so forth. And this is really important. I think you sometimes see across different businesses that everyone is going for the same kinds of behaviours, which doesn't really make sense because different organisations need different behaviours. So organisations are more effective in meeting objectives when employees behave as desired. In other words, organisations will function better when employees are doing the things that help the organisation. Employee behaviours, number 4, reflect the situation, particularly the way we design the situation and context in which employees work. Fifthly, that policies and practices shape interventions, shape behaviours. And the 6th, effective policies support shape desired behaviours. Now, there's for those policies to be effective, they have to support and shape the behaviours we want. So this is the underlying perspective. I think that not just in terms of behaviour change, but in, I think, almost any HR practice or policy, we're trying to shape behaviour. So for example, I'll just take the first one. If one of your strategic objectives was around developing new products, what you would need to do is try and shape and change behaviours around innovation. Now that would need to be made much more specific, but that is the idea. So you start with new products, we need innovative behaviours. What are those behaviours? We need to specify those. Similarly with improving quality, it might be about reducing errors, but again, being more specific. So that's a link between a strategic objective and I guess a headline of what you might need to change. Now, some of you talked about this in the poll a bit, what is behaviour and what is not behaviour? And again, this is absolutely central to the research and the report we did, is that behaviour really is something observable, measurable, and active. It's actually doing something. Conscious thoughts and feelings may also count because they're kind of observable to the individual themselves. So it's odd to think of a thought as a behaviour, but it kind of is in as much as it fulfills those criteria of being observable and specific. And this is crucial. And this is a theme around the report, throughout the report, is that what is not behaviour? So outcomes and results of behaviour are not behaviour. Behaviours may aggregate up to an outcome that's desirable or otherwise, but in themselves, outcomes, results are not behaviours. Attitudes are not behaviours. How people think and feel and perceive is not necessarily a behaviour. States, how someone feels, they may result in behaviours, but again, they're not behaviours. People's values are not behaviours. Activities and tasks are typically composed of a number of quite different behaviours. They're not behaviours in themselves. General vague categories of behaviour, which I'll talk about in a second, are not. Things like teamwork, being enthusiastic, being proactive, again, they're not behaviours either. One useful way I think of thinking about this is to think about, for any of us in our everyday life, how we would, if we wanted to change a behaviour, maybe a friend's behaviour, how would we start to do it? In this example, it's an everyday thing about a friend of yours, a colleague, a partner is trying to get fit. At the top of that list are things that probably will not help you get fit. Things like thinking a lot about it, developing a fitness mindset. This kind of concept is very popular in HR. Telling your friends you're going to get fit, watching a video, buying a Fitbit, buying a juicer, getting nice gym gear. All these things at the top of the list are very unlikely to help you get fitter. But as you go towards the bottom, so go to the gym and actually do some activity, do some lengths in the pool, plan and schedule to go to the gym a number of times per week, find a friend to go jogging with, and then finally something like devising a gym routine and keeping a record of what you've actually done. So this is a good example of where at the top are things that probably will not change someone's behavior very much, and the bottom are things that are more likely. And this is a good model, I think, for thinking about way we change behaviors in organizations, and the fact that HR, it seems to me, is often focusing on things kind of at the top of that list that maybe aren't so useful. So I mentioned already that outcomes, results of work performance are not behavior, but are the consequences of behavior. One way of thinking about that is outcomes themselves cannot be managed. We often talk about managing performance, managing results, managing outcomes. I don't think we can manage those. What we can manage is the behaviours that might contribute to those. There's all kinds of reasons why the behaviours may or may not lead to the outcome. Some of those might be within the employee's control, some are not. But we can focus on managing behaviour. We can't focus on managing an outcome. And again, activities and tasks are not behaviours, the sequences of behaviours, and it's difficult to change behaviours that are not actually behaviours. These are some examples of what we call in the report pseudo-behaviors that kind of sound superficially like behaviours, but probably aren't. Things like being motivated, being results-oriented, taking initiative, solution-oriented, business-oriented, empathic, energetic. These are things that describe, I guess, desirable outcomes, but they're not really behaviours. So asking someone to do one of these things doesn't tell them anything really about what you're asking them to do. It's just a general category. And I think one of my favourite examples I've found when I was researching this report is from Brené Brown's Daring Leadership Behaviours. And these are really good examples of things that are described as behaviours, but are absolutely not behaviours. So for example, if you look in the right-hand column, we have, I extend the most generous interpretation possible to the intentions, words, and actions of others. I don't know about you, but I don't know what that behaviour is. I'm not sure what it means. And similarly, the third one on the right-hand column, I make sure the energy I bring into every room, meeting, or situation is aligned with my values. Not sure what that means. I kind of get it, but I don't know how you would do it as a behaviour. So in a sense, what I'm saying is we are full of behaviours that probably aren't behaviours. So the next point then is, how do we identify employee behaviours that matter? So the idea is we start with an organisational objectives and then start to think about how specific employee behaviours could contribute to achieving that objective. So in this example, it's improving customer service experience. So this is something we may all have felt. We walk into a supermarket, the staff are there or not there, they're doing things or not doing things, and this can affect our customer service, our experience as a customer. So an example here is something, staff approachability. So it may be that what happened in an analysis of looking in your stores, looking at customer satisfaction, it may be you find out that one of the drivers of customer satisfaction and customer experience is this concept of staff approachability. And then through a process which is called pinpointing in the organizational behavior management literature, they discover there maybe are 3 staff behaviors which strongly shape customers' perceptions of staff approachability. Now, of course, this will be established through actually doing some internal research within the business, maybe looking at other sources of evidence as well to say staff approachability seems to be driven by these 3 behaviors. So the first behavior might be making some eye contact with customers, so customers feel that staff are aware. The second example of a behavior might be smiling at customers, so customers feel that someone's actually open to interaction. And the third kind of behavior might be asking customers directly if they require help, so customers know completely in an unambiguous way that you can ask me questions. So these are examples of how you start to pinpoint behaviors based on strategic objective of trying to improve customer experience, in this case, in a supermarket chain. They're just examples. I think something else that came out when I was doing the research report is to be really careful about what we mean when we talk about organizational behavior change. So there's a challenge that often in the behaviors we're talking about, they're not really behaviors. We don't specify them clearly enough. I think the second challenge is often we talk about wanting change, our employees to change behavior without being clear about what we mean by change. So there are multiple meanings, which I think is really important to specify. So some of those are, could it be introducing a new behavior? So again, going back to the supermarket example, it may be that behavior is happening already. It's not completely new. It might be new to some employees, but maybe it's not about something new, but it's about encouraging or increasing an existing behavior. And it could be eliminating an existing behavior. There may be behaviors which are seen as undesirable or are counterproductive to organizational objectives. It could be reducing or increasing the frequency of behavior. So it's happening a bit, but can we make it a bit less or a bit more? It may be the intensity of behavior. So it's not just how often it happens, but the vigor or the energy with which that behavior is performed. And it could be changing when a behavior occurs as well. And I was reminded when I was doing the report, it happened, I went out for lunch in Borough Market, which is a nice market in London, and I was having lunch as a break for writing this report. I went to a restaurant And one of the members of staff, or different members of staff, kept asking me, are you enjoying the meal? Have you been here before? Is there anything else you want, etc., 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 multiple times over maybe a 45-minute lunch. And that was an example where presumably in that restaurant or that restaurant chain, staff had been asked to engage in this behavior, but it maybe wasn't very helpful. And I'll return to that in the end when we talk about a model for actually bringing about behavior change. The next thing is the speed of change. So if we want employees to change behavior, how quickly? Are we talking a week? Are we talking a year, months? What do we mean when we say change in terms of speed? And also what happens when the change you're looking for has been achieved? So is the idea you want it to be stable? So just carry on as is? Do you want it to still change but start to maybe reduce a bit over time? What about if it's still increasing? Is that a desirable thing or not? So these are all the dynamics of change we need to think about and consider quite carefully when we're thinking about changing behavior. So the first one is, what do we mean by behavior? The second is, what do we mean by change? Now, the next thing in the report that we talk about is different models and framework for thinking about why and how behavior changes. Various reviews have found between 60 to 80 different theories and models. In the report, we discuss two in more detail. I'm not going to discuss them today, but there's more detail in the report. There are a lot of theories and models of behavior change, which may be surprising. And as Duckworth and Gross here say, despite rapid growth in the empirical research on behavior change, modern science has yet to produce a coherent set of recommendations for individuals and organizations eager to align everyday action with enduringly valued goals. What does that mean? It means that within HR, when it comes to practice, we should not assume that one particular approach or model is best, and don't believe anyone who tells you that, because there isn't a single one that's best, and a lot will depend on the context. So I found it really fascinating, because again, this is not an area I'd looked into for some years, that there still were so many theories and models around about why and how behavior changes in principle. And something that really, I guess, bothered me when I was writing it is I was thinking, well, why is that? Why are there so many different models and theories? Why would that be? And I think one reason is because there are so many models and frameworks coming from work psychology, health psychology, behavior economics, lots of different areas, because they're in very, very, very diverse contexts. So for example, on the left, you can see you might be interested in the behavior of an individual patient. So if you're a medical practitioner or a patient, you may want to encourage them to quit smoking or to exercise more. And interventions might be individual counseling, information, or goal setting or something else. Then you might do the same thing on a population level, maybe the same kind of outcome, but the kinds of interventions you'd use would be very different. Or it might be the general population in terms of things on the environment, things like more recycling. You want to stop people fly tipping. And you may do things like campaigns, punishments and fines. You might use CCTV. And when I was thinking about this, I noticed an example on the street where I live in London. There's a big sign that says, "Do not fly tip here. Otherwise, you have to pay £1,000 fine." And what is really curious about that is always the area on the street where the most garbage, rubbish, fly tip stuff is actually left. So in terms of that being an intervention to change behavior, it seems to be changing it, but in the opposite or unintended way. But another example, offenders, you may want to reduce reoffending, or with young children, you may want to something like toothbrushing and potty training. I think you already get a sense of the fact that all these theories and models about why and how behavior changes have emerged from really different sort of contexts and areas: air passengers, customers, and finally kind of employees. So when you look across these different examples, you see there are three main dimensions or continua of different. The first is that the environment can easily be redesigned versus it's very difficult to redesign. So for example, in the case of an individual patient, you may be interested in helping them exercise more. As a medical practitioner, you have almost no control over the environment of that individual patient. In other contexts, maybe like on an air passengers on an airplane, you have quite a lot of control over the environment in an aircraft. The second dimension is that behavior change desired is very specific versus very general. So in some cases, with something like toothbrushing for children, you may have a really specific thing you want to change. Others, it might be quite general. like you want people to maybe just kind of reduce a bit more things like fly tipping, or just start to maybe do a bit more exercise. The third thing is the change in behavior is needed or required versus preferred. So a lot of you will be familiar with the idea of nudge, for example, as an intervention. Typically with nudge, you're looking at maybe a very low, cheap intervention, which might have a marginal shift on some people's behaviors. Now, that's a good thing because it doesn't cost much and it might make you quite a small change. In other contexts, you need that behavior. It's not, it would be nice if my kid brushed their teeth. No, they have to learn how to do it. Similarly, it's not, it would be nice if passenger wore seatbelts. They just have to do it. So again, that's another different. And I think if we think about workplace context and the focus of this report, I think we are really talking about in the workplace environment, we can redesign and control quite a lot. The behavior change looking for has to be specific. And also it's a behavior change that is required. It's not just a kind of nice to have. It's a, no, we really want to change this behavior because it's really important for the organization in some way. So it's worth thinking about those different contexts as a way of, I guess, understanding why it is that there are so many different models and approaches around. So one thing that often comes up, and this is, I guess, as a psychologist or maybe certain kinds of psychologists, one of the ideas is that to change behavior, we need to really understand and intervene in its root causes. And one of the clear messages coming out from all the behavior change theory and evidence and psychology and other fields is no, you do not need to understand its root causes. And in fact, searching for them is possibly a huge waste of time, partly because there are things you can't really intervene in much. So if you just think about some of the potential root causes of behavior, we have genetic influences, biological, physiological stuff, the way someone's brought up, their family background, education, work, personality, their history, social norms, mood, etc., etc., etc. So if you look at all the things that drive an individual's behavior, we don't want to or can't intervene in all those things. We don't need to understand it. We just need to really focus on the behavior itself, and particularly changing aspects of the immediate environment. So again, this is quite important. I know within say psychology and certainly within some areas of HR, there is this sense which people want to understand the core meanings and the core drivers, fundamental drivers of behavior. We don't need to do that. We need to focus on the immediate environment and those drivers. So again, I think from an evidence-based HR perspective, and certainly our perspective within CRF, is it is quite important to think about what is ineffective, what seems to not work particularly well. And although that can feel, oh, you know, being a bit negative, certainly my observation would be for any practitioner in any field, what you need to first do is think about, are we doing stuff now with this aim or this goal or this ambition, which probably doesn't work very well. And it's really important to think about that first, because the chances are you as an HR professional or in any profession, the stuff you're doing that probably doesn't work very well. So you almost need to kind of clear the decks a bit and say, let's think about what maybe isn't particularly useful before we look at what is useful. The reason for doing it is that if you don't think about that as a practitioner, you won't ever think there's a reason to change what you do, because you assume that what you're doing is kind of fine. So you won't see a need to change because you assume everything's working. And it may be, but the chances are it also may not be. And these are, I think, some of the approaches and why it's not always so useful. So certainly, I think one reason that organizations change these pseudo behaviors, like being proactive, which is extremely unlikely to change behavior. The second reason, this is a broader reason, is that it's not uncommon for HR practices to not focus on an organizational objective, because that's quite common. So again, if you work in HR, you think of a list of all your main practices, where you're putting resources in, what you're planning for next year. Some of them might be linked to organizational objectives, some of them may not be. So it's more of a broader issue around not focusing on organizational objectives anyway. HR as a profession and managers do not necessarily have a well-developed understanding of behavior change. As Mel said, the underlying theory and evidence around behavior, they probably don't have a great understanding of it, hence the reason for us working on this work psychology network. Organizations often, I think, are so focused on targets and outcomes and hitting behaviors and rolling things out, they pay less attention to the specific employee behaviours that drive performance and focus instead and say, great, we've hit our sales target for this month. That's great. Job done. Well, that's great if you have, but you haven't actually understood what behaviour is driving it. Similarly, you might say next month, oh gosh, we haven't hit our targets. But similarly, you don't understand why that's happening. So I think this focus on results, of course, it's important for businesses to do that. It's essential, but it's equally essential to think about what behaviours are driving or not driving those results. So often there's focus on that. I think there's also, and this is, I guess, maybe a wider HR issue as well, that custom and practice and copying what other organisations do leads to practices which are widely assumed to change behaviour, but which probably don't, or don't very much. And these are just two examples. There's others, but, and just to reflect on this for a moment, just think about, as I'm talking through this, how likely do you think it is that these two approaches will bring about changes in specific employee behaviours that actually drive organisation performance? So think about how likely that is. The first approach is around attitudes, the second approach is around culture, but changing attitudes to change behaviour. So the idea is we might do regular surveys of attitudes, commitment, enthusiasm, identification, engagement, and so forth. The assumption, which is sometimes checked, is that low or bad levels of attitudes cause lower levels of performance. And therefore, the logic of this is you need to intervene to improve attitudes, and then you'll repeat the survey, and hopefully what you'll see is attitudes have improved and performance has improved. That's the logic of this first approach, which I think is not very effective. The second approach is culture change. So culture is observed to believed to be an ongoing cause of undesirable behaviours or a potential cause of the future desirable behaviours you want. So you intervene to change the culture, to change behaviours. Now, just reflect for a moment about where, and it's quite likely if you work in HR, you've done one or both of these things. Think about whether or not you think it will actually change behaviour, given what I've spoken about before about what we mean by behaviour and the link to strategic objectives. So let's take the attitude example first. The first thing is to bear in mind is that general employee attitudes are not particularly strong causes of specific employee behaviours. It's not that they never affect it, but they're not, whatever within the top 10 or 15 reasons of things that might say drive performance or drive behaviour. And they may be in some circumstances be a bit more strong than other circumstances, but broadly speaking, they're not things that particularly drive behaviour. Changing attitudes is quite difficult. This is the other problem. Even if it is a small driver of behaviour, changing attitudes to the extent you need to do it to have an impact on the behaviour you want that's important, again, it's possible, but it's pretty sort of tricky. And certainly, again, in all the behaviour change literature from different fields of psychology, it emphasises that changes in behaviour cause changes in attitude rather than vice versa. In other words, where there are links, it may be that behaviour is driving attitudes, attitudes don't drive behaviour. So this approach, which is very common, I'm not sure is particularly useful. There may be other reasons for measuring attitudes, but if you're doing it to change behaviour, it's probably not that effective. The second example is changing culture to change behaviour. So the first issue here is what on earth is culture? It's something we all feel, sure. We all go into an organisation, we feel whatever the culture it means, but what is it we're actually feeling? What is our evidence? The evidence is often based on a very small number of episodes, a very small number of observable things. And the example I give in the report is in the UK, there is a perception, which actually Mel and I will probably agree with in a way, that people in the north of England are friendlier than people in the south. And if you just start to think about that and unpack it for a moment, what is that actually based on? So, for example, it may be that people who live in the north come, say, to London, and it's very busy, and people don't stop as much, etc. So they've got that perception, but it's based on very, very little data. Similarly, maybe the people from the south go to the north, someone smiles at them, and they seem friendly, so they get this idea they're friendly. But again, what data is that based on? So we perceive these things, but how accurately we do it, how is it possible to? I don't know. You could do it. You could do a huge behavioural survey of the north and south and see there are differences, but that's not data we have. What we have, I guess, is our sort of prejudices about different things, including culture in different organisations. even if there is something like a culture, it's unlikely to be a monolithic or single thing. There probably might exist behavioral norms, but they're probably in subcultures, not some general thing. And also, this to me is a real problem with this argument. If culture is defined as the way we do things around here, which it typically is, that's also known as behavior. Then it doesn't make much sense to say, let's change culture, which is the way we do things around here, in order to change our behavior, which is the way we do things around here. No, this is totally circular. And again, I think culture is not a cause of behavior. At best, it's a description of what we perceive behavior to be. So even if we rethink, and someone did this in the chat earlier, we reposition culture as behavioral norms, then that's okay, but it's still behavior we need to change, not culture. So these are just examples, of two examples, I think, which don't seem to me, they're very common. They kind of miss the mark quite badly when it comes to changing behavior. So let's go on now to behavioral change techniques. And again, from what I said before, you won't be surprised to know that there are many, many different behavioral change techniques. So you see here, these 3 reviews identified on average about 100 different behavioral change techniques. So again, what's the practical, takeaway from this is that no one technique is necessarily better than any other, and don't believe anyone who tells you that. There are multiple techniques which will be more or less effective depending on the context, the behavior you're trying to change, and all sorts of other factors. So there are many different techniques, not surprising. What we focused on in the report is an area called organizational behavior management, which focuses really, and it's one of the few areas linked to work psychology. Organizational behavior, as far as I'm concerned, is kind of the same as work psychology, but it's one of the few areas of research and practice that focuses explicitly on changing behavior, which is one reason why we drew on it so much in the report. So it's based on what they call the ABC model of behavior, which is antecedents, behavior, and consequences. The interventions focus on changing antecedents and or the consequences of behavior. In other words, to change behavior, we can do something before people admit to the behavior, or we can do something after the behavior has been emitted. So antecedents are not exactly causes, but they're anything that triggers a behavior. So antecedents in the environment are stimuli that become antecedents because of their association with consequences. They increase the likelihood that a certain response will occur. They don't literally cause behavior, they communicate information about behavior and its consequences. Behavior, as we discussed, is an observable, measurable, specific action, and consequences are the outcomes that occur as the result of specific behaviors. So these are just some examples of antecedents. I'm not going to get to all of them now. There could be things like communication, instructions and requests from line managers. It could be agreements and contracts. It could be representation of procedures such as checklists. And a very common one I see is, you might see this in public toilets, restrooms, where you see behind the door, there's a list of things that need to be done in order to ensure that that bathroom, say, is cleaned in a way that the organization actually would like it to be cleaned. So it's just to remind people to engage in certain behaviors. Resources, it could be tools, the physical working conditions, the physical layout, the behavior of others in terms of modeling and so on. Arriving early for meetings, for example, if you go to a new job and you see that everybody arrives early, that again might be an antecedent for you to think, okay, in my previous job, everyone was a little bit late, but this is different. It might trigger you to actually start to arrive early as well. And also self-managed antecedents such as self-talk and visualization, those sorts of things. So these are examples of antecedents. These are examples of consequences. There's basic consequences that increase, make that behavior more likely to happen, and they're different forms of reinforcement. And there are consequences that decrease behavior, which make that behavior less likely to happen. So that's some of the consequences. So let's conclude now and just talk about the behavior change model that we developed from the report. It draws heavily on organizational behavior management, the models from that field. So firstly, what behaviors are we trying to change? Specific, measurable, and observable, behaviors that contribute to or drive the organizational objectives, and there are behaviors we deliberately and purposefully want to, and we need to change them. Not behaviors we just quite like it if people did that a bit more or did that a bit less. We're not focusing on that. So a prerequisite for this is really understanding how work actually gets done and how specific behaviours contribute to organisational objectives. So like the supermarket example, if you want to change behaviours that are going to lead to the organisational objectives, you need to understand how employees do their job. How do they work? What is it about what they do and don't do that leads to the consequences that you would like or not like? So it requires quite a detailed understanding of work. So this is the eight-step model. The first is identifying an organizational objective. So for example, the ones I talked about right at the beginning, like developing new products. Start with one of those and start to understand what behaviors might do it. Step 2 is specifying the behaviors that will contribute to that objective. So which behaviors, in which employees and where, when do employees need to do it, what levels of frequency might be important. Step 3, and this is absolutely essential, is to measure the current levels of those behaviors. So this is a step sometimes people miss, but you need to understand, can we measure these behaviors and what's going on now? And then think about, once you've done that, step 4 is what's the current level of behaviors? What are the things that seem to trigger it? Crucially, what are maybe the blockers? What are the things that get in the way of people doing that? And what are the consequences of people doing or not doing those behaviors? Step 5 is giving some behavioral feedback to employees and to teams, and in the supermarket example to stores, about the current level of these behaviors. So what are employees doing now? What gaps exist? Why are those gaps important? And then think about in step 6, how goals can be set to support employees better achieve the outcomes you kind of want. So what are the specific goals? What are the sub goals? And again, how can you find out people doing that? Step 7 is, should those behaviors be occurring, find ways of providing positive reinforcement when those sub goals and goals are being met. So it could be praise, tangible rewards, maybe time off, formal recognitions, lots of different kinds of rewards, which we talk about in the report. And finally, step 8, evaluating change and adjusting. So to what extent have the goals been met? What gaps still exist? And then return to step 1 and check that each step has been followed appropriately, and then adjust any activity you've done in each step to make sure that it's actually most likely to work. So this is an example of saying, start with a specific behavior, understand, objective, understand what behaviors drive it, assess those, see where you are now, see where the gaps are, find ways of closing those gaps, and assess, and then if necessary, go back and start again. So this is the model that's presented in the report, and there's a lot more details there. So finally, I think this is my conclusion when thinking about having done this research and thinking about how it might be relevant. I think that by understanding some of these theories and techniques that we talk about, we draw on from the scientific literature, is really important. I think as a practitioner who wants to change behavior, you need to understand what we know about and don't know about what changes people's behavior. It seems to me to be a pretty tricky task to get into behavior change without knowing a reasonable amount of that stuff. Secondly, I think it's a very good understanding of the context and the organizational objectives. So you've got to understand what might change behavior and what are those behaviors and how will they change in that context to drive the behaviors you want. If you have a good understanding of those 3 things, it will vastly increase the chances that you'll identify the specific behaviors need to change, to what ends, what's the purpose of that change, and how can we best bring about such behavior changes. So to me, this is an absolutely crucial area for organizations, for managers, for HR, but it really does require that those 3 things you have a pretty good grasp of in order to maximize the chances of changing behavior. Thank you. I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Rob. So we have lots of questions, lots of things going on in the chat. I think actually some of them you've touched on in your closing statements as well, though, which is good. Lots of interest around pseudo behaviors.
Oh yeah.
And I reflect personally on how many times I've asked someone to take ownership of something or be responsible, and I've thought, and that's job done. I've explained it perfectly well. There were some questions in the chat about, can these things be useful? Because they're so commonly used at the moment. Is there a world that they can be useful within business?
I don't think so. It's a bit like if you're a parent or whatever, as an example, and you just say to your children, oh, be nice. Yeah, of course. You want them to be nice, they want to be nice, but if you don't understand what it means, what's the chances that you'll get the outcome you kind of want? So I think that they're kind of almost like, I guess another example, they're just warm words. They sound good. Yeah, who doesn't want to be innovative? Isn't that a great thing? But it just ultimately confuses because they're ambiguous. And I guess most important, it won't actually change behavior very much. So I think a lot of those competency frameworks, for example, the Brené Brown leadership behaviors, I think we should really look at these things and say, if it's not a behavior, forget about it.
Okay.
Focus on it. You can focus on the heading. Like I say, we want innovation. Great. But what does that mean in terms of behaviors, and how do you know, and how can you change it? So I think it's a good starting point. But beyond that, they should never appear, should never tell employees to do those things.
Okay. So that's how we sort of check ourselves.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And another key piece, which you talked about as one of your 3 key things at the end, was there was some suggestion that maybe organizations are leaning into these pseudo behaviors because they want to make their change programs relevant across multiple contexts.
Yes.
So that context piece, how important is that, and what does the research say about how important the understanding of that is, and that that we can't use multiple different contexts for one change?
Yeah. So I think if you think of it, so one question that's often asked is that how do you change behaviors at scale?
Yeah.
Like across the whole business, for example. And I guess the reply to that is, well, unless you're a tiny, tiny, tiny organization and every employee in it is basically in the same role, and you have fairly simple strategic objectives. Yeah, you could say we want everyone in this tiny organization to change the behaviors in the same way. But typically, most of us don't work in all. Well, most of us probably do, but in terms of this order, they could think about HR and strategy. Most of us are working in organizations where there's lots of different roles, lots of different parts of it. So even though in terms of, like a culture change, you want people to be more, I don't know, whatever, innovative or empathic or dynamic, or that's the thing that sounds great. And we would like that to happen. But not every employee, even if you could define what that means in terms of behavior, it's not going to be so relevant to every single employee. So the group over here, the function over here, can contribute to organizational objectives in one particular way by its behaviors. A function over here will have to engage in different behaviors to do that. So I would say it's quite important to resist this temptation. I think it's where the whole culture change thing is quite another way, which is quite misleading. Or the values thing. Here's our 5 values. Well, what does that mean? I think the idea of a uniform thing is appealing for leadership because it feels like it's kind of bringing people together. I think that's highly unlikely. And I think we have to go back to the basics, say, what are the strategic objectives? How can this function, this group of workers, and it may not be relevant to them, but if it is, how can they contribute to that? And thinking about the behaviors that particular team, group, or function needs, not right across the board.
Yeah. Interesting. We had a suggestion in the chat about an organization that has encouraged teams to create team charters based on the collective, so that they can think about more specific behaviors that they would need to change in individual teams, which is interesting. There was a question also when you talked about it a little bit when you went into your evaluation and assessment and that cycle back, but people were asking about how we keep momentum and avoid behavioral drift.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the first thing you need to ask is, do you want momentum? So again, going back to the restaurant example, there might have been a momentum building that wait staff were asking more and more and more and more. Have you enjoyed your meal? Is there anything I can help you with? Have you dined with us before? So, but it carried on, and it got to the point where it was really irritating me as a customer. So momentum, it depends on the change you want. So I think, as I said, there's some behavior change you want them to happen, and that's you may want them to slowly disappear again. There may be other behaviors where more and more is better. And I think back to the point, I wouldn't say you have to think whether you need to maintain momentum, but also that's the crucial thing of keeping measuring them. So if you're seeing changes in those behaviors that you think are unhelpful, as in they will not contribute to organizational objective, you need to go back into that cycle. Why? Maybe there's blockers. Maybe there are, the consequences or the antecedents, you haven't got those quite right. You need to re-look at them again. So I guess behind that question is, once you start to make the change, how can you make sure it's continuing in the way you want it to, which is not necessarily about momentum, but it could be. And that's why that cycle needs to be repeated. But that's also really important. I think the idea of doing it and then say, job done, I think that's a mistake. not least because it may be, give it a year, 2 years, even shorter, maybe strategic objectives change. And therefore what you've done is you've changed people's behaviors in ways that are no longer as relevant. So you need to put a quick halt to that and see if you can shape people's behavior in a different way again. But yeah, that continuous assessment of how the change is going is pretty important, I think.
Yeah. I was reflecting on a supermarket example, and I was thinking, yeah, people smiling at you, you know, from all the different people around the supermarket might be wonderfully pleasant, but it also might evoke unpleasant feelings if everyone's grinning at you as you walk through.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's a really good point. And that would be where you'd have to say, we trained all our staff to grin, all going, and that is really disturbing our customer. And that's a good example. Well, we think we've trained this behavior, but we've looked at this and actually we've trained the wrong behavior.
Yeah.
Because it's a totally forced smile that looks slightly threatening. So this is actually having the reverse effect. So you need to say, in other words, they didn't specify clearly enough when they said to people smile, they didn't say what that actually meant. They just, that's a good example. Yeah.
Interesting. You'll like this one. There was a question about how to provide evidence that a behavior is a potential issue to C-suite. Obviously, I know you and CRF are extremely passionate about evidence-based HR. So this is a good one for you.
So how do you persuade?
How do you provide evidence that a behavior is an issue to a C-suite?
Well, it does depend. So from the driving organization performance report I did with CRF, I think last year, it was clear that sometimes the C-suite is very switched on around HR stuff and sometimes not. So let's assume they're reasonably switched on. If they are, that would mean they're looking to the function and saying, how are the things you're doing helping the business? And some C-suites, my understanding is, do not do that. But assuming they are, then you would go to them with evidence about behavior. And the example, and the question was around that's having a negative effect. It could be, it could be that, it could be around something you need to do to have a positive effect. I guess you go to the C-suite, say, here are the business objectives for the next year or 2 years or 3 years. This is a series of behaviors that we think, because of our analysis, will lead to that objective. What we're finding is this is not happening, or what we're finding is there's another behavior has emerged that's actually having a negative effect. And to me, the key thing will be, again, assuming the C-suite are interested in evidence, and sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, is to say this is actually harming the business. So we need to do something else to actually either eliminate that behavior or increase these positive behaviors. I think it would be trying to show the C-suite that you really had a good angle, again, like the supermarket example, that you actually had a really good angle and good evidence and data yourselves as a function in a business about what behaviors are driving staff approachability and the consequences of maybe that dropping or not increasing. And I think then, you would hope, they will be very interested in that and want to listen and could see the value you're adding.
And I'll pause. Actually, we have lots more questions coming through, so I'll come back to you in a moment. But I thought it would be worthwhile, just in case anybody does have to drop off the discussion early, just to give you a little bit more clarity around our work psychology network, how you can get involved in more discussions like this, and hopefully join us in person as well next year. So the membership is 3,000 per organization. And that gets you regular reports summarizing theory and evidence, just like this one on behavior change. It also gets you 2 delegate places at our 3 yearly events. And we'll discuss the reports as well as think about practically how we can apply some of the principles in our organizations. It gets you access to our online discussion forum that will be available to you throughout the year to continue the conversation, just like the very active, lively conversation in the chat right now. And Rob will be curating HR relevant work psychology reviews published in scientific journals to contribute to that discussion himself as well. So there'll be lots of ways to help you apply the science. And I know there is some interest as well. If you are not part of an organization and you're interested in joining as an individual member, I am more than happy to discuss, as we do have some memberships available for those people as well. Will has kindly shared in the chat a summary of what I've just talked about. If you'd like to discuss further, there's a helpful link in there to fill out your details, or you can just email me directly and I'm happy to chat through with you. Thanks. So let's just head back to the questions. There was an interesting one, I guess, linked to your the piece about evidence, and again, something that I know you feel strongly about, employee surveys that don't focus on behaviours. How do we convince senior leaders that are wedded to these surveys that they should be linked to behaviours, or that they're not working?
Great question. By the way, there are some really fantastic questions in this chat, and this is, if you've been reading the chat, this is exactly the kind of debate and discussion that the Work Psychology Network is for. So it's some fantastic examples of the kind of discussion. So one of the points of it is not to say do X, don't do Y. It's actually to get you to think for yourselves about what seems to work in your context using the theory and evidence we can provide you with. So back to the question of surveys. Yeah, I think someone told me not long ago that they said, and I was moaning about surveys, and they said, why do you think people do them? I said, well, they do them because they think it influences behaviour. And they said to me, no, they don't. I said, well, why do they spend all this money and time giving out all these surveys if they're not linked to behaviour? And this person said to me, well, they do it so they can report on it in their annual report. And I said, but supposing it doesn't link to behaviour? They said, well, they don't care. They want to be able to have a number. And that's particularly true, I think, of employee engagement, a number that they can share with, shareholders, stakeholders, the kind of people about, aren't we good? And also it's a way of employer branding and other kinds of things. There's me, naively as a psychologist, thinking, well, you wouldn't measure something unless it was, it was about behavior, unless it predicted behavior. This person saying to me, yeah, what are the reasons that it's not really about that? So the first problem, the first challenge to that question, a great question, is actually, even if employers know it's unrelated to behavior, they still might want to do it. It's just a badge, it's just a whatever. The second bit is in terms of it wasn't. I think, again, it depends how the kind of C-suite you've got and how reactive and responsible they are to this kind of stuff. But I think I would just demonstrate it. So if you're spending hundreds of thousands of euros, dollars, pounds on an engagement survey every year, if it's the case, and it may not be the case, but if it's the case, it really doesn't predict behavior very much or anything of importance to the business. You could go to them and say, look, we keep doing this. Yes, it tells us if things have gone up and gotten down. It allows us to benchmark. I don't know why you would benchmark, but it does. It allows you to track changes. But if it's unrelated to things that are important to the business, it's a useless test. Is what's the point in doing it? There may be other things you can measure and test, absolutely, that do link to that. And I would think it's a process of saying, we've been using this technology, this measure, a very long time now. We can't see the value it's adding to the business. In terms of what we're trying to achieve, other things we can measure or assess or look at that's going to help us more. And I think that's way of persuading, that it's just not giving you good information. And it reminds me of something in the medical sort of medical practice, which is called overdiagnosis, where because you can do a diagnostic test, it tends to be done, and there's a lot of questions about whether they're actually valuable for individual patients or for the health of a community or a country. In other words, you can test for it, but if it's not telling you anything useful, why do it?
Yeah, absolutely. And spend so much money on it as well.
Exactly.
Another thing that businesses typically do spend lots of money on is training programs.
Yes.
What's the research saying in terms of the effectiveness of training programs to change behavior?
Yeah, I think my understanding of it, and it's I know a bit about the huge amount, but my general understanding is unless that training is highly focused in the way we've talked about in terms of specific behaviours, I think it's very, very unlikely to change behaviour. So I think there are many training programs and organisations that are not focused on specific behaviours. They may be trying to achieve other objectives, but I think, and also of course training is only part of it. To change behaviour, it may be much more important to change the environment. So so a lot of the behaviour changes you might want have nothing to do with training. Which again, if you're into training, it's quite hard to understand that. And even if it is, then you still need all the usual things about transfer, about can you support that behaviour anyway? An example we all know where you train people to engage in a behaviour, they get really good at it, they go back to the workplace and they can't do it because they haven't got the resources, there's too many blockers, no one supports them to do it, so they just don't do it. So again, it's kind of that linking between what are the behaviours we need, how can we change? And it may be that training is a really good way of doing it, but it may not be as well.
Okay, yeah. So how we evaluate our training providers and the training that we're doing internally could be critical to this. Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I know there are more questions. I know we could keep going. We will try and have a look at some of those questions in the chat and come back to you offline or perhaps in our discussion forum.
I see a LinkedIn post perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, if you're not following Rob or the CRF on LinkedIn, please do, because we are having this discussion there as well. But thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob, for sharing. And we hope to see you at our next in-person event, February 10th, on predicting performance at work.
Yeah.